My name is Morgan Kane, and from the very beginning of my life, I believed I was destined to serve my country. That belief came from a deep-rooted sense of patriotism, nurtured by the countless stories of bravery I read in dusty old textbooks. I grew up in a two-story house on a quiet street, where maple trees offered shade in the summer. My father, Patrick Kane, was a construction worker with a wiry frame and rough, calloused hands, while my mother, Regina, was a homemaker who prided herself on keeping our place pristine and inviting. From the outside, we seemed like the perfect family. Father, mother, and child. Neighbors saw us as polite, helpful people who minded our own business. We even had a small garden in the backyard where my mother and I used to plant tomatoes and strawberries every spring. During harvest time, my mother would pass out little baskets of fruits to our neighbors, wearing that bright, charming smile everyone loved. But there was always a fragile undercurrent running through our household, an unspoken tension that invaded the atmosphere whenever expectations weren't met. My father, while often a kind man in public, was deeply intolerant of weakness. He believed in strength and toughness above all else. He wanted me to be an athlete or a soldier, or something that demanded discipline and unwavering resolve. My mother rarely contradicted him. Instead, she busied herself with cooking, cleaning, and carefully grooming an image of a united, supportive family. Looking back, that was likely the first time I understood there were things more important to my parents than unconditional love. I remember my father's face the day I told him I wanted to join the military. It was a mixture of stern pride and a flicker of apprehension, as though he recognized both the honor of enlisting and the possible dread behind it. He nodded, reached out to squeeze my shoulder, and said, "I'm proud of you, son. Don't disappoint us." I was 18 then, and his words were enough to make me stand straighter, as though I already wore a soldier's uniform. My mother's reaction was more subdued. She looked away, gripping the kitchen counter, lips pursed. Eventually, she turned and smiled, her eyes slightly moist. She was pleased in theory. Enlisting to serve the country was an admirable act. But she was also worried. I imagine she knew the dangers of war, though at that moment, she did not speak of them. Instead, she handed me a freshly baked roll and said, "At least eat something before you go." I underwent rigorous training at a base far from home, where the scorching heat of the desert tested my resolve. Every day, we ran countless miles, did relentless push-ups, and practiced drills until our uniforms clung to our sweat-soaked bodies. Many recruits wanted to quit, but the instructors' barked orders and unyielding stares created an environment where backing down felt shameful. Every letter I received from home was short and to the point, mostly from my father praising my dedication and telling me to hang in there, rarely more than a couple of paragraphs. My mother's affectionate words were noticeably absent. She merely scribbled her name at the bottom of each note. Despite the difficulties, I pressed on, motivated by the single-minded belief that I was doing something important. While training, I met friends who would become like brothers to me. We shared the same bunkhouse, performed the same exhausting drills, and stayed up late talking about the future. Each of us hoped to return home stronger and more respected than when we left, to become living testaments to the bond forged by adversity. When we finally completed basic training, we received our assignments. Mine led me overseas to a region thick with conflict. The tall chain-link fences, the endless columns of desert sand, the occasional distant booms at night, they all became the new backdrop of my everyday life. My squad's mission was to support local forces and protect supply lines, which meant we spent a lot of time patrolling hostile territories. I was both scared and exhilarated. Then came the explosion that changed everything. It was a morning like many before it, hot and still, though there was a layer of tension in the air, a sense that something was off. We were going down a dusty road dotted with potholes, sweeping carefully for improvised explosive devices. But this one had been well hidden. The next thing I remember was a deafening roar, shrapnel tearing through our vehicle, and a flash of searing heat. When I woke up in a medical tent, everything was a haze of pain and disorientation. My left arm was numb, and I thought maybe it was just asleep or immobilized by medication. I tried to move it, but nothing happened. The medic, a woman with gentle eyes and a stern, tired face, took a deep breath as she explained that my arm had been severed below the elbow. The damage was too extensive to salvage anything. The doctors had done all they could. My first coherent feeling was a swelling panic, because in that moment, I realized I was never going to be the same person again. All the dreams, all the training, all my father's visions of me as a shining pillar of martial excellence, came crashing down at once. My father's words, "Don't disappoint us," echoed in my head, and a wave of shame hit me harder than any physical blow. I tried to fight back tears, but they came anyway, burning hot tracks down my cheeks. During those days of recovery, I was transferred to a better-equipped facility where wounded soldiers were given extensive care. I struggled to get used to everyday tasks, tying shoes, brushing teeth, buttoning shirts with only my right hand. My left side would occasionally burst with phantom pains, the nerves misfiring, tricking my brain into believing the limb was still there. The rest of my squad offered moral support. They reminded me that losing a limb didn't take away my sacrifice or honor. But a dark voice in my mind kept hissing that I was incomplete, worthless. Eventually, the day came to call home. I remember the phone trembling in my hand. My mother picked up, sounding harried. When I told her the news, she fell silent for a moment, then responded with a strained, almost mechanical calm. "At least you're alive," she said. "We'll figure it out." My father didn't come to the phone that day. I imagined him in his favorite armchair, posture rigid, staring off. Perhaps he felt disappointed, or maybe he was just stunned. None of that mattered. I hung up with a gnawing dread inside my stomach, the sense that something fundamental between us was irreversibly broken. Returning home was a surreal experience. I stepped off the plane, my uniform still crisp despite the indefinite discharge that awaited me. My parents stood near the arrival's gate. My mother held a small sign that read, "Welcome home." My father stood stiffly, his face pulled tight, his lips pressed into a thin line. When my mother saw me, she started to wave, though her arms stiffened halfway. Up close, I could see the emotions flitting across her eyes. Relief, anxiety, disappointment. She tried to hide them behind a polite smile. My father, on the other hand, offered his hand for a shake, glanced at my missing arm, and pulled me in for a brief one-armed hug. In the car ride back, the conversation was tense and fragmented. My father asked about the plane ride, about the weather overseas, about how soon the doctor expected me to fully recover. My mother sat in the back seat, rummaging through her purse as though the contents would reveal some magical solution. I leaned against the window, trying not to feel the emptiness in my left sleeve. Our house looked almost the same as when I left. Manicured lawn, white picket fence, the porch swing I had once used to watch summer sunsets. Inside, however, the atmosphere was fraught. My old room had been mostly cleared. My father had turned it into an office space, with a large wooden desk and shelves. A camp bed was set up in the corner, a makeshift arrangement, and there was a box of my old things stacked against the wall. My mother hovered at the doorway, apologizing for the changes, explaining they thought I might not return for years. I nodded, swallowing a lump of confusion and sadness. That first week was excruciating. I tried to navigate the house with some sense of independence, but tasks that once seemed trivial became monumental. Opening a jar of pickles, carrying groceries, tying a tie. These felt like humiliating reminders of how much I had lost. My parents, especially my father, showed little patience. When I struggled, he would watch with an unreadable expression, sometimes frowning, sometimes turning away. My mother might lend a hand if she happened to be nearby, but she did so with the hollow efficiency of someone completing a chore. "I'm sorry," I'd say whenever she helped. "I'll get better at this." She would nod quickly, avoiding my gaze. Then, she'd mumble something about dinner or chores and hurry away. One morning, I heard them arguing in hushed voices. My mother's tone was urgent, as though she was trying to explain the complexity of the situation. My father's replies were blunt and cold, laced with frustration. I caught snippets like, "He can't find a job this way," and "all this is going to cost us," and I never asked for this burden. The word burden lingered in my mind, stinging like an open wound. Days turned into weeks, each marked by further awkwardness. My father pushed me to apply for desk jobs in local businesses, urging me to contribute financially, reminding me that being a veteran might secure me some special consideration. Yet, in every interview, the employers would glance repeatedly at my missing arm. They tried to remain polite, but I recognized the pity or the uncertainty in their eyes. There were times I felt so desperate, I questioned whether I could endure living under my parents' roof any longer. I tried looking into veteran assistance programs. I called government offices, spent long hours on hold, only to be shuffled from one bureaucrat to another. My father grew increasingly impatient. My mother retreated into her chores, or sometimes disappeared for an entire afternoon to run errands. The strain in the house was palpable, so thick you could taste it with each breath. Eventually, a new conversation started to form. My father pointed out that I needed more advanced medical care and perhaps specialized therapy, things that our local clinics couldn't easily provide. My mother listened, nodding along, occasionally offering a small hum of agreement. At first, I believed they wanted to move somewhere else together, a place with better medical support. I foolishly let myself dream that we might be forging a new path. But slowly, the truth seeped out in tidbits of conversation. They wanted me to move to a rehabilitation facility for veterans, far away from them. I confronted them one night at the dinner table, hands trembling with anger and disappointment, voice breaking. "Are you actually planning to send me away?" I demanded, my tone raw. My father glared, pushing his half-eaten plate aside. "We're just trying to do what's best. We can't give you the care you need here," he said curtly, refusing to meet my eyes. My mother's face twisted with guilt. "It's a good facility, Morgan. You'll be with people who understand you," she whispered, as though that made it any better. Their intentions might have had some glimmer of practicality, but I saw through the hollow justifications. They were not only unprepared to handle the emotional toll of my new reality, they were also unwilling. My presence was a reminder of failure and vulnerability. My father, especially, couldn't bear to see his heroic son in such a diminished condition. As for my mother, her timid nature had always made her yield to his wishes. That evening we exchanged bitter words. In a rush of frustration, I told them how I had lost my arm believing I was doing something that would make them proud, something that would secure our family's sense of honor. They, in turn, claimed they never asked me to make such a sacrifice, implying it had been my own choice and I had to deal with the consequences. The resentment in the room felt like a living, breathing entity, forcing us all into corners of blame and justification. A week later, they helped pack my few belongings into cardboard boxes. My mother tried to hug me goodbye, tears brimming in her eyes, but all I could do was stand there, numb with betrayal, as my father slammed the trunk of our battered sedan. He drove me to the facility without speaking more than a few words. Upon arrival, he handed me a piece of paper with a number scribbled on it, a contact for the administration. Then he got back into the driver's seat, gave me one last parting glance, and drove away. That was the moment I realized my parents had effectively disowned me. The rehabilitation facility was a sprawling complex of gray buildings, tall fencing, and paved walkways. Inside, men and women of all ages rolled by in wheelchairs, or limped on prosthetics, or tried to steady themselves with crutches. Some had visible scars, while others carried hidden wounds that ran much deeper. The staff, though professional, seemed perpetually overworked. There weren't enough resources to go around, and new patients poured in every week. I found myself in a cramped dormitory, sharing space with 3 other veterans. We became each other's emotional anchors. There was Jason, a soft-spoken man who had lost a leg, but never lost his sense of humor. Vera, an older Army nurse who had been medically discharged after a spinal injury. And Kieran, a former pilot who battled severe PTSD and rarely left his bunk except for group therapy sessions. We bonded over our collective frustration, trading stories about how we ended up here and what we'd do if we ever got out. Group therapy became a lifeline, even though I initially resisted the idea of opening up to strangers. The sessions took place in a large circle of chairs, an eager counselor urging us to share our feelings. I spoke of the explosion, of the emptiness when I realized my arm was gone. Eventually, I told them about my family's reaction. As I spoke, I saw heads nodding in sympathy. Some had spouses who left them after their injuries. Others had families who couldn't cope with their mental scars. The tragedies were diverse, but the sense of betrayal felt universally crushing. In time, I found a sense of belonging. For the first time since my discharge, I was around people who understood the trauma, the physical limitations, and the psychological scars. The facility itself, unfortunately, was underfunded. The heating was patchy, medical supplies sometimes ran short, and meal portions were meager. But the sense of camaraderie kept us going. I remember one rainy afternoon, sitting with Jason on a bench outside the building. The drizzle soaked our thin jackets, but we stayed put, staring into the distance. He asked me what my plans were once we left the facility. "I don't know," I confessed, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "My parents sent me packing. I guess I'll figure it out on my own." Jason gave me a long, thoughtful look. "We all have to figure it out on our own eventually, family or not." His words stuck with me like a stubborn burr. 3 months later, after a relentless routine of physical therapy and counseling, I was deemed fit enough to leave. It was a bitter departure. The facility was meant for short-term rehabilitation, but it had become a refuge in my eyes. I had no job, no permanent home, and no guarantee of acceptance from anyone. Still, I clutched my determination like a shield. I was not the naive young man who went off to war dreaming of medals and parades. I was a survivor, scarred but still standing. My first stop was a tiny studio apartment in a rundown area on the outskirts of the city, the only place I could afford with my meager veteran benefits. The building smelled of mildew, and the walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbors' arguments through the night. I slept on an old futon, the overhead light flickering ominously at times. Yet I felt a sense of ownership. This was mine, a space I had secured with my own resourcefulness. From there, I embarked on a journey of reconstruction, not just physically but mentally. I started with the basics, learning to cook simple meals one-handed, figuring out how to manage rent and bills. I picked up a few online courses on computer skills, seeking any path that might lead to stable employment. Meanwhile, I applied for more assistance through various veteran support organizations. Most of them had long waiting lists, but I refused to give up. Finding a prosthetic arm that fit my budget proved nearly impossible. Government-issued prosthetics were often outdated models, limited in function and comfort. So I resorted to a second-hand prosthetic from a local charity, one that sometimes pinched my skin. But it was better than nothing, allowing me to appear just a bit more normal in public. Over time, I discovered a knack for cybersecurity. I had always been decent with computers, but the necessity to find remote or desk-based work sharpened my focus. I poured hours into tutorials, practicing with free software. When I felt confident enough, I started applying for internships and entry-level positions. Rejections flooded my inbox. Some pointed to my lack of formal education, others gave no reason at all. Still, I soldiered on day after day, often surviving on cheap microwavable meals. Between job searches, I joined online communities of disabled veterans. We exchanged tips for survival, from making ends meet to dealing with stigma. There was a measure of solidarity in knowing we were all outcasts trying to piece our lives back together. Occasionally, we'd meet up at community centers or coffee shops, forging friendships in person. We laughed at dark jokes only we understood, about hospital visits, malfunctioning prosthetics, and the bureaucracy that tangled our lives. Nearly a year after leaving the facility, an opportunity finally arrived. A small tech startup, intrigued by my unconventional background, offered me a junior position in their cybersecurity division. The pay was modest, but it was a genuine start. I couldn't stop smiling the day I signed the contract. I worked harder than I ever had, sometimes staying late into the night, determined to prove my worth. My colleagues, for the most part, treated me with respect, occasionally asking about my military service but never prying. They cared about results, not appearances, and in that environment, I began to truly heal. Little by little, I moved from that decrepit studio into a slightly better apartment. Nothing luxurious, but a place that didn't make me shiver every time the wind howled outside. I upgraded my prosthetic arm to a newer model, thanks to a small raise and some assistance from a local veteran nonprofit. Life was moving forward one careful step at a time. As the months turned into years, I honed my cybersecurity skills, earning certifications and even mentoring newer recruits. My self-confidence, battered and bruised after the explosion and my family's abandonment, started to mend. I stood taller, engaging in local volunteer work to help veterans who had been as lost as I once was. I rarely thought of my parents, partly because remembering them reopened old wounds. They had effectively cut me out of their lives, and I had done the same. But destiny, or perhaps a cruel twist of fate, was not done with me yet. One afternoon, as I was finalizing a client's security report, I received an unexpected email from a name I hadn't seen in ages. Regina Kane, my mother. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the screen. For several minutes, I just hovered the cursor over the email, uncertain if I should open it. Memories of that day when my father had driven away, leaving me alone at the rehabilitation facility, flooded back. I took a deep breath and finally clicked. The email was brief and formal, almost as though written by a stranger. It read, "Dear Morgan, I hope you are well. Your father has fallen very ill, and medical bills are piling up. He had a heart attack last month and requires ongoing treatment. I am writing to you because we have no one else to turn to. Insurance won't cover all the expenses, and our savings are nearly gone. Please understand that we are in dire need of financial help. Regina." No apology, no explanations, no warm words of regret or love. Just a plea, plain and simple. They needed money. I stared at the email, torn between a surge of anger and a pang of guilt. They had cast me aside in my darkest hour. Now, in their desperation, they were crawling back. I resisted the urge to reply immediately. Instead, I closed the email, letting my emotions simmer. Over the next few days, I tried to focus on my job, but my mind kept returning to that email. Scenes from my past looped in my head. My father ignoring me, my mother's distant eyes, the box of my belongings shoved into the car. At night, I lay awake, wrestling with conflicting urges. The desire for revenge, the sense of duty that still lingered, and a faint echo of the love I once felt for them. I decided to respond with caution. I composed a brief message. "Mother, I received your email. I'm sorry to hear about Father's health. I need some time to think about how to help you. I will be in touch. Morgan." I hit send, my hand trembling on the mouse. What exactly did they expect from me? Did they think I would just open my wallet and erase years of betrayal? Then again, I couldn't deny there was a piece of me still yearning for some familial bond, some closure to the pain. Days passed without any further message from my mother. Perhaps she was waiting for me to decide. My mind kept returning to a line from her email. "We have no one else to turn to." That line pierced me in ways I couldn't quite articulate. They had cast me out as a burden, yet now they were the ones who needed assistance. Was I to be their lifeline? Eventually, I discussed the matter with Jason, my old friend from the rehabilitation facility. We still kept in touch, meeting for coffee once in a while. When I showed him the email, he raised an eyebrow. "That's some nerve," he muttered, shaking his head. "You owe them nothing, but maybe you need to see them face to face to truly heal." He wasn't wrong. A part of me suspected that ignoring them would leave an open wound forever. Confronting them, on the other hand, could lead to closure even if it ended badly. I arranged a short leave from work and bought a bus ticket to my hometown. The landscape whizzed by in a blur of green fields and rolling hills, but my mind was far too occupied with the past. When the bus pulled into the station, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, as though stepping on that old pavement would resurrect buried ghosts. My parents' house was the same in essence, a modest two-story structure with a small porch. The paint looked more faded, and the lawn was unkempt. Walking up those steps brought a rush of memories, both pleasant and bitter. I knocked on the door and waited, my breath shallow. After several moments, my mother appeared. The years had etched lines into her face, her once dark hair streaked with gray. She looked at me with a mixture of anxiety and something else, perhaps relief or shame. "Morgan," she murmured, stepping aside to let me in. The hallway seemed dimmer than before, as though the house itself had aged. "Your father is resting upstairs," she whispered, closing the door behind me. I followed her up the creaking steps, each one a reminder of the old life I'd left behind. My father lay in the bedroom, propped up by pillows. He had lost weight, his cheeks sunken, his once tough demeanor tempered by illness. When he saw me, he shifted uncomfortably, trying to maintain some semblance of composure. But I could tell he was weakened, physically and emotionally. "Son," he rasped, voice dry. A few seconds of silence stretched between us, weighted by all the words left unspoken over the years. "Thank you for coming." I nodded, my jaw clenched. I wanted to feel sorry for him, but a wave of resentment welled up. Where had this gratitude been when I needed a home, an arm over my shoulder, a simple affirmation that I was still their child? My mother explained the situation in hushed tones. The hospital had run multiple tests, discovered blockages in his heart, and insisted on surgeries. The insurance only covered a portion, leaving tens of thousands in unpaid bills. They were behind on mortgage payments, on credit card debt, and she feared they would lose the house. That's when it hit me. Everything they had worked for was on the brink of collapsing, and they saw me as the final resort. I stood there, listening, a whirlwind of emotions raging inside me. Part of me wanted to walk away, to let them taste the full consequences of their choices. But another part of me remembered a childhood when, despite their flaws, they had cared for me, put food on the table, and provided shelter. Anger battled compassion in my chest, and I was unsure which would win. My father, reading the turmoil in my eyes, spoke haltingly. "We know we failed you," he began, coughing weakly. "We can't go back and change that. But if you can find it in your heart, please help us. You'll never have to see us again after this. We can't handle this alone." The words spilled out in a broken plea, one that felt both genuine and manipulative. I took a deep breath and responded. "I'm not here out of obligation. I'm here because I want to end this cycle of resentment. But I need to understand something. Why did you abandon me when I needed you most?" My voice trembled despite my attempts at composure. My mother sat on the edge of the bed, wringing her hands. "We were ashamed," she confessed, tears pooling in her eyes. "You came back wounded, different, and we didn't know how to handle it. Your father was angry at the world, and I was too weak to stand up to him. We pushed you away because we thought we couldn't bear the pain of seeing you that way, reminding us of everything we feared." My father closed his eyes. "It was easier to pretend you'd be better off in that rehab facility, away from us. I see now how selfish that was," he admitted in a strained voice. He stopped, the words turning into a fit of coughing. I stood there, uncertain how to feel. Their confession seemed honest, but it was also painfully insufficient to mend the years of hurt. Still, the fact that they were voicing this at all was more than I ever expected. I decided to stay in town for a few days. My mother made up my old room, removing some of the office clutter. I had planned on getting a motel, but she insisted, and I allowed it, more out of curiosity than anything else. I wanted to see what it felt like to live under their roof again, even briefly, to gauge if there was any chance for healing. Each day, I accompanied my father to his doctor appointments. We sat in waiting rooms, flipping through outdated magazines while the medical staff called him in for tests or checkups. He was frail in a way I'd never witnessed before, vulnerable like a child. My mother hovered, fussing over every small detail, from his medication schedule to his diet. Times, I saw flashes of genuine affection. Other times, I was reminded of my own convalescence years ago, the stark contrast to how they had handled that situation. One afternoon, I asked my father point-blank if he felt regret. We were in the hospital corridor, waiting for my mother to finish talking with a nurse. He stared at the linoleum floor. "Every minute of every day," he replied, his eyes glistening. "I had my own vision of what it meant to be strong. When you came back hurt, my illusions shattered, and I took it out on you. I was wrong." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, a faint stirring of empathy kindled in me. However, the wounds were deep. I recognized he was apologizing, but it also felt born of desperation. Without his health crisis, would he ever have reached out to me? Doubt gnawed at my mind. Back at the house, bills covered the kitchen table like a swarm of locusts. Medical statements, mortgage notices, collection letters. My mother sat at the table, her eyes rimmed in red from crying. The total debt was enormous, far more than they could handle on their own. Their house was in danger of foreclosure, and time was running out. I found myself in a moral quandary. My success in cybersecurity had allowed me to save a decent sum, and I had carefully invested part of it in a small portfolio. While I wasn't wealthy, I had enough to make a significant dent in their medical bills. But what would that mean for me? Would it be a final transaction that severed our relationship forever, or the start of genuine reconciliation? Over those few days, I wrestled with my conscience. Late at night, I walked through my old neighborhood, passing the childhood park where I'd learned to ride a bike, the convenience store where I once bought candy with spare change, the basketball court where I practiced my jump shot. Memories of simpler times flickered in my mind, some joyful, some overshadowed by a father whose ambition often overshadowed paternal warmth. On my last evening in town, my mother prepared a simple meal, roasted chicken and mashed potatoes. The three of us ate in near silence, the weight of unsaid words pressing down. Eventually, I set my fork down and spoke, my tone resolute. "I've decided to help you with your bills," I began. My mother inhaled sharply, tears welling in her eyes. My father looked away, as though the burden of gratitude was too heavy to bear. "But," I continued, "I want you to understand this isn't a reset button. We can't just pretend the past never happened." My mother reached for my hand, but I pulled back gently. "Thank you," she managed, voice choked with emotion. "We won't forget this." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak further. Deep inside, I felt a complex swirl of relief, resentment, and cautious compassion. The next morning, I visited the hospital's billing department, accompanied by my mother. With a combination of my savings and some structured payment plans, I paid off a hefty portion of the debt. Watching the billing clerk file the paperwork, I experienced a strange catharsis. This was my final gift to the people who had failed me. I left town shortly after, not sure if I'd ever return. On the ride back, I expected to feel empty, drained by the final confrontation. Instead, a certain calmness settled over me. I had acted on my own terms. I hadn't let my parents' crisis overshadow my personal growth, nor had I let vengeance consume me. Back in the city, life resumed. My boss at the tech startup welcomed me warmly, pleased that I had returned sooner than expected. My projects had piled up in my absence, but immersing myself in code and security protocols felt therapeutic. I told Jason about my decision, and he merely nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "I guess sometimes letting go is its own reward," he mused. In the following months, I received sporadic updates from my mother. My father underwent surgery, followed by a slow recovery. Though still weak, he was stable. She thanked me multiple times via email, each message slightly warmer than the last. I responded politely but kept my distance, unsure whether I was ready for full-fledged reconciliation. Time, as it tends to do, moved forward. I continued to advance at work, eventually managing a small team responsible for incident response. It was a demanding role, but I thrived under pressure, forging solutions during high-stakes digital threats. My personal life also took a hopeful turn. I began dating Claire, a kind-hearted physical therapist who worked at a local sports clinic. She never flinched at my missing arm or the scars that traced across my body. Instead, she admired my resilience, and her gentle support gave me the courage to share parts of my story I had kept buried. I proposed to Claire on a quiet evening by the riverside, the city lights twinkling behind us. She said yes, tears sparkling in her eyes. We moved into a modest condo together, pooling our resources to build a life we both cherished. For the first time since losing my arm, I felt a profound sense of belonging, of forming a family of my own design, one built on empathy, honesty, and unconditional respect. Yet, the specter of my parents lingered in the back of my mind. I wondered how they were doing, especially my father. Occasional emails from my mother suggested he had begun a cardiac rehabilitation program and was making slow progress. She hinted that he sometimes asked about me, though he never wrote me directly. One warm spring afternoon, I found myself rereading a recent email from my mother. She had offered to come visit me, claiming my father wanted to apologize in person. My initial reaction was protective. I didn't want them intruding on the new life I had created, especially not when my wedding was on the horizon. Claire, ever understanding, pointed out that perhaps this was a necessary step if I wanted to move beyond the bitterness that still flared up in quiet moments. After some thought, I agreed to let them visit for a weekend. The arrangement was simple. They would stay at a nearby motel, we'd meet up for a few meals, and I'd show them around my life in the city, my workplace, our condo, the places I frequented. Claire saw it as an act of closure, a chance for me to demonstrate how far I had come. The day arrived with a swirl of nerves. I drove to the bus station, the same station I had used when I first left home, and there they were. My mother stepped off the bus, smiling tentatively, a small suitcase in hand. My father followed, walking with a slight stoop, his once imposing figure now more fragile. I approached them, hands in my pockets. "Morgan," my father said quietly. "You look," he trailed off, eyes scanning the modern prosthetic that peeked from my shirt sleeve, taking in my posture, the city clothing that signaled I no longer belonged to his old world. We exchanged awkward hugs. My mother's embrace was warmer this time, tears trembling on her lashes. I led them to my car, the conversation stilted. Once we started driving, I tried to fill the silence with small talk, asking about the bus ride, their motel reservations, basic pleasantries. Our first stop was the office building where I worked. I showed them the airy open-plan space, the computer stations, the meeting rooms plastered with project timelines and brainstorming notes. My colleagues greeted them politely, some even offering a handshake. My father stood quietly, occasionally giving me a nod of approval. My mother seemed fascinated by the environment, noting how different it was from any workplace she had known. That evening, Claire joined us for dinner at a quiet, family-run restaurant. She had spent weeks mentally preparing for this encounter, knowing how delicate the situation was. My father seemed reserved around her, his usual confidence muted by the fact that he was now a guest in my world. My mother, however, opened up, asking Claire about her profession, her family, and how we met. After the meal, we went back to our condo. We sat in the living room, sipping tea in a circle of gentle lamplight. My father cleared his throat. "Morgan, I want to thank you," he began, voice heavy. "You saved our lives by paying those bills, and I haven't properly expressed my regret for how we treated you." He paused, struggling for the right words. "I wish I could take it all back, but I can't. I can only promise to be better, for whatever time I have left." My mother clasped her hands. We lost sight of what mattered, and by the time we realized it, we thought it was too late. "I can't excuse our behavior. We just—" She choked back tears, unable to continue. I listened, my chest tight. Claire placed a reassuring hand on my knee. I took a moment to gather my thoughts. "I appreciate your honesty," I replied, my voice steady. "I won't pretend everything is magically fixed, but I do think we can try to build something new, if that's what we all want." My father nodded, and a single tear slid down his cheek. It was the first time I'd ever seen him cry. My mother let out a small sob and leaned into him. The moment was raw, a dismantling of the stoic barriers we had all clung to. In the weeks that followed, my relationship with my parents took on a cautious new shape. They remained in their hometown, but we spoke more regularly, sharing updates about our lives. My father's health stabilized, and he even took up gentle exercise classes recommended by his doctors. My mother found part-time work at a local library to help with the remaining bills. Claire and I moved forward with our wedding plans, uncertain if we should invite my parents. But after careful reflection, I decided to extend an invitation. It was a gesture that might affirm our truce, a bridge to the future. The day of the wedding was a mild autumn afternoon, golden sunlight spilling through the trees at the outdoor venue. Friends from my job, old comrades from the rehab facility, and a few neighbors gathered to celebrate. Jason served as my best man, steady and supportive as always. Seeing my parents seated in the front row, dabbing their eyes at the ceremony, felt surreal. They were older, more vulnerable, and no longer the omnipresent authorities I once knew. When Claire and I exchanged vows, I glimpsed my father wiping tears. My mother clasped her hands together, mouth turned up in a trembling smile. It struck me then. This was a far cry from the cold, distant household I had once endured. After the ceremony, pictures were taken amidst laughter and cheers. My father managed a weak grin when the photographer asked for a group shot. My mother hugged Claire, whispering words of congratulations I couldn't quite catch. For all the painful history between us, there was genuine joy in their eyes. That image, my parents standing alongside my new wife and me, sorrow and hope intermingling, would stay with me forever. As the reception got underway with music and dancing, I found a quiet moment to step aside with my father. We stood near a blooming arbor, the notes of a gentle tune drifting through the air. He cleared his throat. "I'm proud of you," he said softly, his voice laden with emotion. "Not just for today, but for everything you've accomplished." He looked down, shuffling his feet. "I know I never said it enough." I met his gaze, heart pounding. "Thank you," I replied, my voice tinged with gratitude and lingering sadness. "I've waited a long time to hear that." He pressed his lips together, nodding slowly. "Better late than never, I suppose." We stood in silence for a few moments, letting the music wrap around us. In that silence, words failed to mend all the fractures, but something else took root. Forgiveness, or at least the beginning of it. Married life suited me. Claire and I found our rhythms, supporting each other through career hurdles and day-to-day joys. My job at the tech company evolved, and eventually I was promoted to a senior role. Meanwhile, Claire's expertise in physical therapy expanded to the point where she considered opening a small practice of her own. During holidays, my parents occasionally visited. Sometimes we'd spend Thanksgiving together in our condo, the air filled with the aroma of roasting turkey and sweet potato casserole. Other times, we'd celebrate a small Christmas at their old house, sharing simple gifts and reflecting on how far we'd come. The tension that once reigned was replaced by a measured warmth. It wasn't perfect, old wounds never fully disappear, but we learned to navigate them, to not let them define us. The biggest challenge came when my father experienced another health scare, another heart complication. He was rushed to the hospital late one night, and my mother called in a panic. Claire and I packed our bags, driving through the darkness to be by his side. In the hospital corridor, I stood waiting, memories of my own hospital stays washing over me. It was a twisted irony. I had once been that wounded patient, longing for their presence. Now I was the one holding vigil for him. We stayed there for days, catching sleep in uncomfortable chairs, living off vending machine snacks. My mother clung to my side, tears in her eyes, thanking me repeatedly for not abandoning them. I assured her we were past that. Claire helped coordinate the doctors, making sure my father received the best care possible. I watched him cling to life, his body frail beneath a tangle of tubes and wires, and I realized how fleeting everything was. Despite the anger I had harbored, I genuinely didn't want him to die. In a way, that hospital vigil brought us closer. When my father finally stabilized and woke up, he squeezed my hand. He looked up at me with watery eyes, voice weak. "Morgan, I'm grateful," he managed, his words barely audible over the hum of medical machinery. "I'm grateful for second chances." I nodded, swallowing a lump in my throat. Life, it seemed, was constantly handing us chances, to love, to hate, to forgive, to try again. Some people squander them, others hold on tight. As years rolled forward, I found a sense of peace I once thought impossible. My arm was still missing, of course, replaced by my latest prosthetic model, a sleek, advanced device that allowed for more refined movement. I no longer felt shame over my stump. It had become part of my story, a testament to my resilience. Claire's small physical therapy practice blossomed, catering to athletes and injured workers alike. I continued my work in cybersecurity, eventually starting a consultancy that focused on nonprofits and institutions dedicated to assisting veterans. My mission was personal. I wanted to protect the digital infrastructures of organizations that helped people like me. My parents aged into a more subdued chapter of their lives. My father, though still burdened by a weakened heart, found solace in tending a small garden in the backyard. My mother volunteered part-time at the library, content with the quiet rhythm of shelving books and assisting patrons. They kept a framed photo from my wedding on the mantel, a symbol of how the tides had turned, of a fragile but meaningful reconciliation. When Claire and I decided to start a family, we visited them with the big news. I'll never forget the look on my father's face when we told him he would be a grandfather. He blinked back tears, then reached for my mother's hand. They both smiled at me with an affection I'd once believed they were incapable of. In that moment, I recognized how much life could change, and how love, however broken, could still flower in unexpected ways. Our child arrived one crisp morning in early spring. Claire cradled our baby girl, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. I gently held the little one, my prosthetic arm supporting her back in a delicate balance of metal and warmth. In that instant, all the pain of the past, the heartbreak, the abandonment, the struggles, it all seemed like stepping stones leading to this tender, miraculous moment. We named her Hope, a testament to the belief that no matter how dark things get, there is a light at the end for those who seek it. My parents arrived the next day, timidly entering the hospital room, bearing a small bouquet of flowers. My mother reached out to hold her granddaughter, her face lit with awe. My father hovered beside her, offering gentle coos and soft smiles. I watched them, remembering a time they couldn't bring themselves to stand by my bedside, too overwhelmed by shame and fear. Now, they stood hand in hand, joy illuminating their wrinkled features. As I looked at my newborn daughter, I made an unspoken promise that I would never abandon her, that I would love and accept her no matter what challenges fate might throw her way. I also made peace with the broken pieces of my history. My parents had hurt me more than anyone else in the world, but in recognizing their own frailty, they had found a way to atone for their actions. We weren't perfect, and we never would be, but we were a family once again. In the end, my parents' call for help, though initially jarring, became the catalyst for a new beginning. Their debt was paid, but more importantly, our emotional debts were gradually settled through honest conversations, tears, and the collective acceptance that we were all flawed human beings trying to do better. So here I stand, an arm short, but a heart full. I have known betrayal and disappointment, but I have also known redemption and hope. My parents, the ones who once turned their backs on me in my darkest hour, are part of my life again, a life now vibrant with promise. And as I hold my daughter, feeling the soft rhythm of her breath against my chest, I realize that sometimes the greatest revenge is not vengeance at all, but the courage to heal, to grow, and ultimately to forgive. Happy endings are never simple, nor are they the end of the journey. They're just a signpost that we've finally reached a clearing in the forest, a place where the sun breaks through and warms our faces, reminding us that life can still be good, and love can still prevail, even after all the scars we bear.